The shovel hits something hard beneath the dirt, and the metallic clang echoes through my grandmother's abandoned barn like a gunshot. My hands are shaking as I brush away decades of accumulated soil from what looks like a metal box, buried here since 1976, according to the date scratched into its surface. 24 hours ago, I was just another 18-year-old aging out of St. Mary's Children's Home with nothing but a duffel bag and a bus ticket. Now I'm standing in the middle of nowhere, holding what might be the key to understanding why my family abandoned me and why my grandmother, Emma Campbell, left me this crumbling farm in her will. The box is heavier than I expected, and my heart pounds as I carry it toward the shaft of sunlight streaming through the barn's broken roof. Inside, wrapped in yellowed plastic, are dozens of letters tied with a faded ribbon, a stack of photographs, and something that makes my breath catch in my throat. A birth certificate with my name on it, but not the story I've been told my entire life. According to this document, my mother didn't die in a car accident when I was 3. She was Emma Campbell's daughter, and she lived until I was 7 years old. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. But first, let me take you back to where this all started, because the truth about my family was buried deeper than just dirt and time. 3 weeks earlier, I was sitting in the office at St. Mary's, staring at the stack of papers that would officially release me into the world with no safety net. Lisa Rodriguez, my caseworker, had been trying to prepare me for this moment for months. But nothing could really make you ready for the reality of being completely alone at 18. That's when the call came. Lisa answered her phone with her usual professional tone, but I watched her expression change as she listened. She kept glancing at me, her eyebrows rising higher with each passing second. When she finally hung up, she just stared at me for a long moment. "Your grandmother died," she said, and I almost laughed because it was such an impossible statement. I didn't have a grandmother. I didn't have anyone. That was the whole point of growing up in the system. But Lisa continued, explaining that a lawyer named Kevin Foster had been trying to locate me for weeks. Apparently, Emma Campbell had left me her farm in rural Kansas, along with a letter that had been sealed for over a decade. The next few days passed in a blur of legal paperwork and confused conversations. Kevin Foster was a patient man with kind eyes who seemed genuinely surprised by my existence. He explained that Emma Campbell had been searching for me since I was placed in foster care, but the records had been sealed, and by the time she found the right channels, her health was failing. She'd spent her final years making sure everything was in order for when I turned 18, including setting aside money for my travel expenses and the first year's property taxes. The letter she left me was brief but devastating. She explained that my mother, her daughter Janet Chavez, had struggled with addiction and made choices that put me in danger. Emma had tried to get custody, but the courts ruled against her, citing her age and remote location. She'd never stopped loving me or trying to find a way to bring me home. The farm was her apology, her hope that I might find the family and belonging she'd been unable to give me when I needed it most. I read that letter at least 50 times during the bus ride to Kansas, trying to reconcile this version of my story with the one I'd carried for 15 years. The landscape outside the window shifted from city sprawl to endless fields, and with each mile I felt like I was traveling not just through space, but through time, back to a life that should have been mine. The town of Millbrook was smaller than I'd imagined, just a main street with a few shops, a diner, and a gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. Kevin Foster met me at the bus stop, and during the 20-minute drive to the farm, he filled me in on the practical details. The property was 40 acres, mostly pasture land with a farmhouse, barn, and a few outbuildings. Emma had been living alone there for the past decade, keeping to herself but maintaining the respect of her neighbors through her reputation for fairness and hard work. When we pulled up the gravel driveway, my first thought was that the house looked tired. The white paint was peeling, the front porch sagged slightly, and several windows were boarded up. But there was something solid about it, something that spoke of permanence in a way that nothing in my life ever had. This was a place where generations had lived and died, where roots grew deep into the soil. Kevin handed me the keys and left me alone to explore. The house smelled like dust and old wood, but underneath that was something warmer, something that might have been cinnamon and vanilla from decades of holiday baking. Emma's furniture was still there, covered in white sheets like ghosts of the life I'd missed. In her bedroom, I found more photographs, images of a woman who looked remarkably like me at different stages of her life. There was also a picture of my mother as a child, grinning gap-toothed at the camera while standing next to a horse. But it was in the kitchen that I found the first real clue about what Emma had been trying to tell me. Tucked inside a cookbook, was a hand-drawn map of the property with an X marked in the barn and a note that simply said, "The truth about Janet is where you'd expect to find buried treasure." That's how I ended up with a shovel in my hands, digging in the exact spot marked on Emma's map. The metal box had been wrapped in multiple layers of plastic and buried about 3 feet down, preserved against time and weather. Along with the documents I'd already discovered, there were cassette tapes labeled with dates going back to my mother's childhood and a thick folder of letters between Emma and various social workers, lawyers, and private investigators. The story that emerged from these papers was nothing like what I'd been told. My mother hadn't died in a car accident. She died of an overdose when I was 7, but not before she'd spent years in and out of treatment, fighting to get clean so she could reclaim custody of me. Emma had supported her through multiple attempts at recovery, paying for rehab programs and providing a safe place for Janet to stay when she was sober. The cassette tapes were the most heartbreaking discovery. They were messages my mother had recorded for me during her lucid moments, explanations and apologies, and promises that she'd tried so hard to keep. In one, recorded just months before her death, she talked about the farm and how much she wanted to bring me there, to show me the place where she'd grown up and where I belonged. I sat on the barn floor until sunset, listening to my mother's voice and reading Emma's desperate letters to social workers who seemed determined to keep us apart. There were legal documents showing that Emma had tried to adopt me after Janet's death, but her age and my placement in a stable foster home had worked against her. She'd never stopped trying, never stopped hoping, but the system had decided that an elderly woman living alone on a remote farm wasn't the best option for a grieving child. The anger hit me all at once, a rage so pure and overwhelming that I had to step outside and walk the property lines until my breathing returned to normal. All those years of feeling unwanted, of believing that no one had ever fought for me, and the truth was that 2 women had loved me enough to battle impossible odds. They'd lost, but they'd tried, and somehow that made all the difference. Over the next few days, I threw myself into the practical work of assessing the property. The house needed significant repairs, but the bones were solid. The barn required a new roof, and most of the fencing would need to be replaced before I could consider any kind of livestock. Emma had left detailed records of the farm's finances, including a modest savings account that would cover basic repairs and living expenses for about a year if I was careful. It was while I was in town pricing materials at the hardware store that I met Alan Gomez. He was probably in his 60s with weathered hands and kind eyes that reminded me of my caseworker, Lisa. He introduced himself as Emma's nearest neighbor and offered his condolences along with his help. Apparently, Emma had mentioned me to him over the years, always with hope that someday I'd find my way home. Alan became my informal guide to rural life and the unspoken rules of small-town community. He taught me how to read the land, how to spot problems with drainage and soil quality, and which local contractors could be trusted to do good work at fair prices. More importantly, he helped me understand Emma's place in the community and, by extension, what my place might be. Emma Campbell had been respected, but not particularly social. She'd kept her struggles with Janet private, but people knew she'd lost her daughter and that there was a grandchild somewhere she couldn't reach. Her final years had been marked by a quiet dignity that earned her the community's protective silence. No one had pried into her business, but everyone had been ready to help if she'd asked. The first real test of my acceptance came when I hired Larry Garcia to repair the barn roof. Larry was Alan's nephew, a man in his 30s who ran a small construction business and had a reputation for honest work. He arrived on a Monday morning with his crew and spent the first hour just walking around the property, assessing not just the immediate job, but the farm's overall condition. "You planning to stay?" he asked me directly, and I realized this was about more than just construction work. This was about whether I was serious about becoming part of the community or just another outsider looking to flip property for profit. I told him about the letters, about Emma's search for me, about my mother's dreams of bringing me home. I showed him the cassette tapes and the photographs, and I watched his expression soften as he understood that this wasn't just inheritance, it was reclamation. The work on the barn became a kind of community project. Alan stopped by most days to check on progress and offer advice. Victoria Long, who ran the local diner, started packing extra sandwiches in case the work crew was hungry. Even Jerry King, the mail carrier, began lingering for conversations about Emma and stories about the farm's history. It was Jerry who told me about the garden. Emma had maintained a large vegetable garden behind the house for decades, sharing the excess with neighbors and donating produce to the church food pantry. The garden had been neglected since her death, but Jerry thought the soil was probably still good if I wanted to try planting something. I'd never grown anything in my life, but something about the idea appealed to me. Maybe it was the thought of my hands in the same soil where Emma had worked, or maybe it was the practical consideration that fresh vegetables would help stretch my limited budget. I bought seeds and basic tools, and Alan helped me clear the weeds and prepare the beds. The physical work was harder than I'd expected, but there was something deeply satisfying about it. Each day I could see tangible progress, could point to specific accomplishments. The house was slowly becoming livable, the barn was weatherproof again, and tiny green shoots were emerging from the garden soil. For the first time in my life, I was building something instead of just surviving. But it was the discovery of Emma's journals that finally helped me understand what I'd inherited. I found them in a trunk in the attic, dozens of composition notebooks dating back to the 1950s. Emma had been a meticulous record keeper, documenting everything from weather patterns and crop yields to her thoughts about raising Janet as a single mother after her husband's death. The entries about Janet's childhood painted a picture of a happy, energetic girl who loved horses and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. But as Janet entered her teens, the entries became more worried, more desperate. Emma wrote about finding drug paraphernalia, about Janet's mood swings and disappearances, about her own feelings of helplessness as she watched her daughter spiral into addiction. The most painful entries were from the years after I was born. Emma wrote about visiting me in foster care, about the supervised visits that broke her heart, about Janet's promises to get clean that were made and broken over and over again. She documented every legal battle, every setback, every small victory that ultimately led to nothing. But she also wrote about hope. Even in her final entries, written when she was already sick and knew she was dying, Emma expressed faith that someday I'd find my way to the farm. She'd prepared everything she could, left every clue she could think of, and trusted that love would eventually bridge the gap that law and circumstance had created. Reading those journals changed something fundamental in how I saw my situation. This wasn't just about inheriting property or finding family history. This was about continuing a legacy of love that had persisted despite impossible obstacles. Emma and Janet had fought for me in their own ways, and now it was my turn to fight for the life they'd wanted me to have. The turning point came in late summer when Charles Richardson approached me about leasing some of the pasture land. Charles ran cattle on several properties around Millbrook, and he'd had an informal agreement with Emma for years. The lease payments weren't substantial, but they would provide steady income and help keep the land productive. More importantly, Charles' offer represented full acceptance from the farming community. Leasing land required trust, the kind of trust that was earned through reputation and proven character. By extending the same arrangement he'd had with Emma, Charles was signaling that I belonged here, that I was part of the community's future. The lease signing took place at Victoria's Diner, with Alan and Jerry as witnesses. It was a simple ceremony, but it felt momentous. As I signed my name on the contract, I thought about all the documents I'd signed over the years, forms that had moved me from one temporary placement to another. This was different. This was about staying, about putting down roots, about claiming a place in the world. Fall brought its own challenges and rewards. The garden produced more vegetables than I could possibly eat, so I followed Emma's tradition of sharing with neighbors and donating to the food pantry. The simple act of giving away tomatoes and squash connected me to the community in a way that nothing else had. People began stopping by not just to help or check on me, but to visit, to share stories, to include me in the informal network of relationships that held small towns together. It was during one of these visits that Laura Smith, the librarian, mentioned the town's annual harvest festival. The event had been a tradition for over 50 years, and Emma had always participated by donating preserves and baked goods for the auction that raised money for the volunteer fire department. Laura wondered if I might be interested in continuing that tradition. I'd never canned vegetables or baked anything more complicated than cookies, but the idea of participating in Emma's place felt important. Victoria offered to teach me her grandmother's recipe for apple butter, and Alan's wife helped me understand the basics of preserving. The work was time-consuming and occasionally frustrating, but there was something deeply satisfying about filling jars with food I'd grown and prepared myself. The Harvest Festival was my first real community event, and I was nervous about how I'd be received. But from the moment I arrived with my contributions, people went out of their way to welcome me. They shared stories about Emma, about Janet as a child, about the farm's history. They asked about my plans for the property and offered advice about everything from winter preparations to crop rotation. Most importantly, they treated me not as Emma's charity case or Janet's abandoned daughter, but as myself. I was the new Campbell on the old Campbell farm, and that was identity enough. The weight of belonging settled around my shoulders like a warm coat, and for the first time since leaving St. Mary's, I felt truly at home. Winter on the farm was a revelation in solitude and self-reliance. The social connections I'd built during the warmer months didn't disappear, but they shifted into the quieter rhythms of rural winter life. Alan still stopped by regularly, and Victoria always had a seat saved for me at the diner's counter. But most days I was alone with the land and the house and my own thoughts. I used the long evenings to continue reading Emma's journals and listening to my mother's cassette tapes. What had initially been painful reminders of loss gradually became sources of comfort and guidance. Emma's practical advice about maintaining the property proved invaluable, and Janet's recorded messages helped me understand not just what had happened to our family, but why the farm mattered so much to both of them. In one tape, recorded during what must have been a particularly clear-headed moment, Janet talked about the sense of peace she'd found during her childhood summers working in Emma's garden. She described the satisfaction of hard physical work, the connection to something larger than herself, the feeling of being rooted in a place that had meaning beyond the immediate moment. She'd wanted that for me, she said, wanted me to know what it felt like to belong somewhere completely. Spring brought new challenges and new growth, both literal and metaphorical. The garden I'd planted the previous year had taught me valuable lessons about soil and timing and the importance of patience. This year, I expanded the growing area and added fruit trees, thinking not just about immediate needs, but about the decades ahead. I was planning for a future on this land, investing in permanence. It was also in spring that I received a letter from Lisa Rodriguez, my former caseworker. She'd heard about my inheritance through the network of social workers who tried to keep track of their former charges, and she wanted to know how I was adjusting. Her letter was warm and encouraging, but it also reminded me of how far I'd traveled, not just geographically, but emotionally. A year earlier, I'd been counting down the days until I aged out of the system, terrified of being completely alone in the world. Now I was planning crop rotations and considering whether to add chickens to the farm. I had neighbors who checked on me, a community that included me in their traditions, and a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. The second Harvest Festival was different from the first. Instead of being the newcomer trying to prove my worth, I was simply part of the community's annual rhythm. My preserves and baked goods were accepted as natural contributions, and people asked my opinion about local issues as if my voice mattered. Because it did matter, I realized. I'd become a stakeholder in this place, someone with both investment and influence in its future. It was at that second festival that Emma Campbell, who ran the antique shop and shared my grandmother's name, approached me with a proposal. She'd been thinking about the farm's history and my family's story, and she wondered if I might be interested in documenting it properly, not just for my own understanding, but as part of the town's historical record. The idea intrigued me. I'd been so focused on moving forward, on building a life in the present, that I hadn't fully considered the value of preserving the past. But Emma Campbell was right. My family's story was part of Millbrook's story, and both deserved to be remembered accurately. Working on the Family History Project became my winter focus during the second year. I interviewed longtime residents who remembered my mother as a child, gathered photographs and documents, and slowly pieced together a more complete picture of the Campbell family's place in the community. What emerged was a story of ordinary people dealing with extraordinary challenges, of love persisting despite failure, of hope surviving even death. The project also connected me with distant relatives I hadn't known existed. Emma's research into genealogy records led to contact with cousins and second cousins scattered across the Midwest. People who remembered Janet and had wondered what happened to her daughter. These connections didn't replace the family I'd lost, but they expanded my understanding of where I came from and who I was. More importantly, the historical work helped me understand my role as the current caretaker of the Campbell legacy. I wasn't just living on Emma's farm. I was continuing a story that stretched back generations. The decisions I made about the land, the traditions I chose to maintain or modify, the way I participated in community life, all of these things would become part of the record that future generations might discover. The third spring brought an unexpected opportunity. Charles Richardson approached me about expanding our partnership. His cattle operation was growing, and he needed more pasture land. But instead of just increasing the lease arrangement, he proposed something more ambitious. He wanted to help me develop part of the farm for sustainable agriculture, combining traditional farming methods with modern conservation practices. The proposal would require significant investment and commitment, but it also offered the possibility of making the farm truly profitable. More than that, it represented a chance to honor Emma's values while building something new. She'd been a careful steward of the land, and this project would continue that tradition while creating opportunities for the next generation. I spent weeks researching sustainable farming practices, consulting with agricultural extension agents, and working with Charles to develop a comprehensive plan. The project would take several years to fully implement, but the potential benefits extended far beyond financial returns. We would be creating habitat for wildlife, improving soil health, and demonstrating that small-scale agriculture could be both economically viable and environmentally responsible. The decision to move forward with the Sustainable Agriculture Project felt like a declaration of faith in the future. I was no longer just surviving on Emma's legacy, I was building upon it. The scared 18-year-old who'd arrived with nothing but a duffel bag had become someone capable of making long-term plans and taking calculated risks. But perhaps the most significant change was in how I saw myself. For most of my life, I defined myself by what I lacked. No parents, no family, no permanent home, no sense of belonging. Now I define myself by what I had. A place in the community, a role in preserving both land and history, relationships built on mutual respect and shared purpose. The Sustainable Agriculture Project officially launched in the fourth spring with a ceremony that drew visitors from across the region. Agricultural experts, environmental advocates, and local officials all came to see what we'd built. But for me, the most meaningful moment was when Alan Gomez, now in his 70s and moving more slowly but still sharp as ever, told me that Emma would have been proud. Standing in that same barn where I'd first discovered the truth about my family, I realized that the buried treasure Emma had left me wasn't just the documents and photographs. It was the understanding that love doesn't end with death, that family can be both blood and choice, and that home is something you build as much as something you inherit. The farm today looks nothing like the tired, neglected property I'd first encountered. The house gleams with fresh paint, the barn houses modern equipment alongside Emma's old tools, and the fields are green with crops that feed both cattle and soil. The garden has expanded into a small market operation, supplying vegetables to Victoria's Diner and several restaurants in the county seat. But the most important changes aren't visible in the landscape. They're in the relationships that connect me to this place and these people. Jerry King still delivers my mail, but now he's also the godfather to my daughter, born 3 years ago to me and my husband, Kevin Foster, the lawyer who first brought me home. Alan Gomez taught her to walk in the same garden where he taught me to plant, and Victoria Long is already planning the birthday cakes she'll make for all the celebrations ahead. Charles Richardson and I have expanded our partnership to include educational programs for urban students interested in sustainable agriculture. Every summer, we host young people who, like me, are looking for their place in the world. Some stay for just a few weeks, others return year after year, and a few have decided to make rural life their permanent choice. The historical project has grown into a small museum housed in one of the restored outbuildings. Visitors come to learn about farming history and conservation practices, but they also discover the story of families like mine, of love that persists across time and circumstance, of the ways communities can heal both land and people. I still have Emma's journals, and I've started keeping my own. My daughter will grow up knowing not just where she came from, but why it matters. She'll understand that the Campbell farm isn't just our home, it's our responsibility to the past and our gift to the future. Sometimes late at night when the house is quiet and the fields stretch dark under the stars, I think about the 18-year-old girl who stepped off that bus with nothing but hope and heartbreak. I want to tell her that the loneliness will end, that the questions will find answers, that the love she's always craved is waiting just beyond the next hill. But mostly I want to tell her what Emma and Janet somehow knew despite all their struggles and failures. Family isn't just about blood or law or circumstance. It's about the people who fight for you even when they lose, who leave you maps to treasure even when they can't be there to help you dig, who trust that love will find a way to bridge any distance. The truth I found buried in that barn wasn't just about my past. It was about understanding that every ending can become a beginning, that every loss carries the seeds of something new. Emma's death brought me home. Janet's struggles taught me the value of the stability I'd found. The years I'd spent feeling abandoned prepared me to recognize and cherish true belonging when I finally found it. 5 years after that first desperate dig in the barn dirt, I'm standing in the same spot with my daughter on my hip, pointing out the place where Mama found the letters that brought us home. She's too young to understand the story yet, but she'll grow up hearing it, knowing that she comes from a line of women who never stopped fighting for family, even when the odds seemed impossible. The farm is thriving in ways Emma could never have imagined. The Sustainable Agriculture Project has become a model for other small operations, and we're hosting our third annual conference on conservation farming practices. The museum attracts visitors from across the region, and the educational programs are booked solid through the next 2 summers. But success isn't measured just in profits or recognition. It's in the morning coffee shared with neighbors who become family, in the satisfaction of work that feeds both body and soul, in the knowledge that this land will be better when I pass it on than it was when I inherited it. Kevin often jokes that he married into the Campbell family, but the truth is that we all married into it. This community adopted me as completely as I adopted it. And our daughter is growing up surrounded by aunts and uncles and grandparents who share no blood with us but claim us completely. The cassette tapes Janet left me have become family treasures, recordings I'll share with my daughter when she's old enough to understand her grandmother's struggles and dreams. But I've also started making my own recordings, messages for the future about the life we've built here, the lessons we've learned, the love that sustained us through every challenge. Emma's map led me to one buried treasure. But I've discovered that the real treasure was never hidden underground. It was in the soil itself, in the community that embraced me, in the work that gave my life meaning, in the love that connected me to both past and future. Last month, I received a letter from a young man aging out of foster care in California. He'd heard about our educational programs and wondered if there might be a place for him here, a chance to learn sustainable farming and maybe find the kind of belonging he'd never known. I wrote back immediately, enclosing a bus ticket and the promise of a warm welcome. Because that's what Emma would have done. That's what Janet would have wanted. That's what family means. Not just taking care of your own, but expanding the definition of your own to include everyone who needs a home. The cycle continues, and every new person who finds their way to our farm adds another layer to the story that began with Emma's desperate search for her granddaughter. We're not just preserving agricultural traditions or conservation practices. We're preserving the radical idea that family is something you create, not something you are born into, and that home is something you build with your hands and heart. My daughter's first word was not mama or dada, but dirt, spoken while she was sitting in the garden, tiny fists full of the soil that has sustained our family for generations. She'll grow up understanding that this earth is both inheritance and responsibility, that the work we do here matters not just for us, but for everyone who comes after. The Sustainable Agriculture Project has expanded beyond our farm to include partnerships with other small operations throughout the region. We're proving that rural communities can thrive without sacrificing environmental values, that traditional farming wisdom can be enhanced by modern conservation science, that small-scale agriculture can be both profitable and sustainable. But the most important lesson we're teaching is about the power of second chances. Every young person who comes to work with us, every neighbor who stops by for coffee and conversation, Every visitor who learns about our family story carries away the understanding that it's never too late to find your place in the world. The museum now includes not just the Campbell family history, but stories from dozens of local families who've faced their own challenges and found their own ways home. We've become a repository for the kind of stories that don't make it into official histories, the quiet struggles and small victories that define most people's lives. Emma's journals have inspired me to be more intentional about documenting our daily life, not just the dramatic moments, but the ordinary ones that actually make up most of existence. The morning ritual of feeding chickens, the satisfaction of a successful harvest, the simple pleasure of watching my daughter discover the world around her. These records will be part of what I leave behind, along with the improved soil and the restored buildings and the community relationships that sustain this place. But more than anything, I hope I'm leaving behind the understanding that love is the most renewable resource we have, that it multiplies when shared and grows stronger when tested. The young man from California arrived last month, and watching him explore the farm for the first time brought back all the memories of my own first day here. The same mixture of hope and fear, the same desperate desire to belong somewhere, the same wondering if this might finally be home. His name is Jerry King, and yes, he shares a name with our mail carrier, which caused some initial confusion, but also immediate acceptance. Small towns love coincidences like that, and Jerry's arrival has been treated as a sign that he belongs here. He's working with Charles on the cattle operation and learning sustainable farming practices. But more importantly, he's learning what it means to be part of a community. Today marks exactly 6 years since I first arrived in Millbrook, and I'm writing this final entry in Emma's journal while sitting in the same kitchen where she wrote her hopes and fears about finding me. My daughter is napping upstairs in the room that was once my mother's, and through the window I can see Jerry and Charles working on fence repairs in the same field where I planted my first garden. The circle feels complete, but not closed. Each generation adds new chapters to the story, new understanding to the legacy, new love to the foundation that holds it all together. Emma's desperate search for her granddaughter has become my confident welcome to young people who need what this place gave me. Janet's struggles with addiction have informed my understanding of how to help others overcome their own challenges. The farm is profitable now, sustainable in every sense of the word. We're feeding people, caring for the land, providing education and opportunity, and creating the kind of community that nurtures both individual growth and collective well-being. But the real success is measured in smaller moments. The way my daughter runs to greet Jerry when he comes in from the fields. The satisfaction in Charles' eyes when he talks about our conservation achievements. The letters I receive from former program participants who've started their own sustainable operations. Kevin and I have talked about expanding our family, about the possibility of adoption as well as biological children. The farm has room for more love, more stories, more second chances. We've learned from Emma and Janet that family is something you fight for, something you build, something you choose every day. The historical project has evolved into something Emma never could have imagined. We're not just preserving the past, we're actively creating a better future. The techniques we've developed are being replicated on farms across the region. The educational programs are training a new generation of sustainable agriculture advocates. The community model we've built is inspiring similar projects in other rural areas. But beyond all the measurable achievements, there's something simpler and more profound. I wake up every morning in a place where I belong completely, surrounded by people who chose to love me and whom I chose to love in return. The abandoned, frightened teenager who stepped off that bus has become a woman with roots deep in this soil and branches reaching toward tomorrow. If you're listening to this story and wondering if it's possible to find your own version of home, I want you to know that it is. Maybe not in the same way, maybe not in the same place, but the possibility exists. Love is always looking for ways to connect us, to heal us, to bring us home to ourselves and each other. The treasure buried in Emma's barn was never really about the documents or the photographs. It was about understanding that we're all part of stories larger than ourselves, that the love we give and receive echoes across generations, that home is something we create together. So wherever you are right now, whatever challenges you're facing, whatever dreams you are carrying, remember that your story isn't finished. There are people you haven't met yet who will become family, places you haven't seen yet that will become home, love you haven't experienced yet that will change everything. Subscribe to hear more stories like this one, and tell us in the comments about your own journey toward belonging. Share this video with someone who needs to know that family is something you find as much as something you are born into, and that it's never too late to discover where you truly belong. The Campbell Farm will always be here, welcoming new chapters to our ongoing story, proving every day that love planted in good soil will always find a way to grow.